Hi class. Today we are jumping into chapter 11, which focuses a lot on effective communication, which can be the foundation of truly effective leadership. We're going to talk about a communication from the coach to the athlete, from the athlete to the coach. We'll discuss communication between the referee, the officials, and the coaches, a whole bunch of different pathways for communication. And your book really kind of talks about the fact that coach communication skills are very, very essential in order to open up appropriate dialogue between all the different individuals that are present within a sporting situation. So your book really talks about appropriate communication from between the coach and the player, assistant coaches, other coaches from the opposing teams, parents, referees, teachers and educators, the media, as well as the coach's supervisor. And I just want to touch briefly before we jump into the PowerPoint slides, talking about essential communication between players and coaches. So it's essential that coaches maintain an open dialogue with each team member, and this can also include athletic trainers. And there's a whole bunch of different things that are important for you to discuss with the players, such as obviously teaching sports skills, team strategies, team roles, team policies, things of that nature. But then also maybe also following up with things like performance goals and what their expectations for when they are on the field during competition versus when they're doing practice. It's important also to make sure their communication is positive with the athletes, because a coach who maintains a really distant impersonal relationship is going to sacrifice a level of trust, a level of loyalty that you're going to need if you want to really lead a successful team. Communication with assistant coaches. This is soliciting information from the assistants about performance of various players on the team. It could also be about opposing teams or developing some sort of strategy. This will, again, establish effective relationships that will establish trust and loyalty. Other coaches, if you guys have been coached before, you understand that sometimes communication with the other coach can be a little bit difficult, especially if it's maybe a really big team rival or someone that maybe you just don't personally care for. But it is important to make sure that you're open effectively to be able to at least approach a coach, or to be the one approaching the coach first for small comments. You'll find also if you're ever a high school coach, that coaching community, those few number of coaches that are actually in the same league, in the same conference, it's a very small circle, and you're going to see those people over and over again. And as you kind of develop your skills as a coach, especially if you're a first-time coach, you're going to understand the importance of having relationships with the opposing team's coaches for beneficial purposes later on, maybe in the season or in future seasons or years to come. Communication with parents. We kind of talked a little bit about this in class, but if a coach really wants to gain the loyalty of the athletes, communication with parents is normally inevitable. It's appropriate and it's very sensible. It's sensible in the fact that you can cut off a lot of misinterpretations that might come from dealing with young athletes. Young athletes won't always take what you say in practice and go home and communicate what you said correctly. And so there's room for misinterpretation. And we know sometimes that kids can get ideas in their head, maybe take what you've said incorrectly, and that can really blow up with a parent that's maybe very overprotective with their child. So a way to kind of head that off is to make sure that you keep this open dialogue in order to establish that level of trust and understanding. Because it can prevent more difficult situations from arising later on. Referees, it is important to communicate with the referees, and unfortunately we see a lot of negative communication, but just kind of like how I said about it being a very small coaching community, but very small circle of people, there are a lot of referees that will actually not a lot of referees, there are a few amount of referees that actually volunteer and be paid to referee, let's say, a high school girls soccer match for the regular season play. One being because it's definitely hard to be a referee, but number two, it requires a certain level of education, not a whole lot. And individuals that do this are going to be repeated throughout the course of the season. So again, having a good relationship with the referees can save you some interesting situations later on in the season or in potential future seasons and years to come. Also, in regards to educators, in my experience being a coach, the more quickly you establish a relationship with the student athletes instructors, the more quickly you'll get those individuals on your side. Teachers kind of have this idea that coaches are more about sports than they are the academic classroom. And unfortunately, there have been instances where this has been true when it's been blatantly obvious to the instructors. But if you happen to be a community coach in a high school, do whatever you can to establish relationships and communication with the high school teachers. If you get them on your side, they will bend over backwards to assist you. If you do have an athlete, let's say, that maybe is at risk or is just not doing what they're supposed to be in class. Media. Your textbook talks about some suggestions that elite sports organizations offer as advice to their athletes, specifically about athlete communication with media. Talking about not being baited, to remain calm all the time, if you happen to be quoted inaccurately. Avoid using jargon, talk so that the public can understand you. Don't forget that you're always on. I think athletes, actually all of us sometimes forget that if you post something on social media, if you say something on camera, that's out there. You can't take it back. Also be very precise. Make your point in 20 seconds or less. Be yourself and speak clearly and slowly. And then finally, your textbook talks about communication with your supervisor. If you guys have ever had a boss before, you understand the importance of establishing and maintaining that relationship. To make sure that you have positive interactions and positive future interactions as well. So, some things you may have thought about, some things you may have not. And now we're actually going to jump into the PowerPoint when it talks about the 10 commandments of effective communication in sport. There we go. So this is from the perspective of the coaches. This is the 10 commandment for coaches in regards to effective communication. So we're going to talk about being honest, not being defensive, being consistent, empathetic, not being sarcastic, talking about praising and criticizing behaviors, not someone's personality or traits, respecting the integrity of others, using positive nonverbal cues, so that a lot of the times that comes from body language, teaching appropriate skills, and interacting consistently with all team members. The first commandment talks about coaches being honest with their players, and it makes a couple points. Number one, dishonesty ruins credibility. Say, for example, you have a player that's really having issues hitting the ball, and they're striking out. Maybe they're not getting on base, and instead of actually being honest with the player and telling them, you're having issues, I need to let so-and-so step up and really kind of step up to the plate for us, no pun intended. Don't give them a reason as, oh, I'm just saving you for later. You're great, you're doing fine. That's really not going to get you anywhere. Because it can cause the player to believe the coach, but it can also give them reason to be very frustrated with their lack of success, mostly because you haven't been honest with them. Another way to make sure that you're honest is to keep your promises to your athletes. So if you have an injured player that's really excited, is ready to be back, the trainer has cleared them, and they're caught up in the team's present success, and the coach just says, you know what, I'm not going to put you back in. This can cause a player to be extremely disappointed. So if you've told the player that you're putting them in, you need to follow through and put them in, because you don't want to create those feelings of mistrust. And then they also talk about being a model. The successful coach is honest, really without stepping on someone's toes or egos. So the example set here is a volleyball player was improving in her skills, but she was not getting played. She wasn't getting playing time. And her coach acknowledged her progress and was realistic in projecting the future. He didn't make any promises to avoid emotional disaster, and instead he saw to it that the athlete's participation would be as fulfilling as possible. So this is an example where a coach is being honest with their player, even though the player is frustrated. The coach would acknowledge that, but not promise them, oh, I'm going to promise I'm going to get you, and trying to find opportunities to put that player in where that player would be successful, in order for him or her, to have that appropriate playing time on the field or on the court. The next commandment is thou shalt not be defensive. Typically, defensive people are ones that feel that they always need to be right, that they have to justify their decisions and actions maybe to the players or to the parents. Sometimes these are individuals that are threatened if someone has given them a difference of opinion about a certain situation, and sometimes they're also very insecure. It's important to understand that you don't gain the trust and loyalty of athletes and assistant coaches by being on your heels all the time. So some strategies to help you not be a defensive coach would be to open ideas to opinions of others, be an active listener, and also seek assistance from the right professionals. Thou shalt be consistent. The confidence and security that athletes feel toward their coach can absolutely be destroyed by inconsistencies. So this is, making your players run really hard every practice, and all of a sudden saying, we're not going to do that anymore. And then all of a sudden, 2 weeks later going, guess what? We're going back to running. It doesn't allow time for the athlete to adjust and to be able to truly understand your behaviors and actions. So some guidelines for consistency would be to praise good athletic performance, recognize the greetings of others, give them a high five coming on or off the field, or just a hey, glad to see you practice. Be sincere. If you're a coach that says, I don't have a door in my office, he pulls the I'm going to take the door off my hinges because I have an open door policy. Really mean it. Don't have your door closed, and don't refuse to meet with athletes. Be careful to control anger that can be communicated destructively, so lashing out, and also be consistent with the discipline. Thou shalt be empathetic. This is the ability to understand and respond to the feeling of others. And a lot of times this is missing from techniques and strategies used by team leaders. And typically this is a strategy that's applied in order to breed loyalty. Being empathetic is used. I think in states that have really serious sports, and I think of Florida as one of them, I think of Texas as another for football. We have to be able to understand and respond to athletes when they say, I need a break, I need to get some water, I'm feeling really overheated, mostly for safety reasons. It is not in the best interest of athletes or coaches to yell at them, to tell them that they're a pansy and that they need to get back on the field. It needs to be listened to, it needs to be acknowledged, because when you don't, you have situations where athletes are literally falling out on the athletic field and you're calling the ambulance, heaven forbid something else happened to them, like their heart stops. So empathetic is about understanding and responding to the needs and feelings of your athletes. So some guidelines that we can provide for our coaches is talking about not attacking the athlete's character. So that would be basically referred to as not making it personal. Be sensitive to the feelings of others. Don't allow peers or teammates to become verbally destructive toward one another. That can also really break a team down, is when you allow situations between your athletes to kind of explode. And then also make sure that we're never embarrassing anyone, whether it's the athletes, your assistant coaches, officials, especially in public. If you have words that you need to exchange with a coach, with an athlete, you need to be respectful. You need to do it behind closed doors, because that goes also back to being a role model. And when your athletes see that it's okay for you to scream and yell and throw things, that's something that they're going to take with them, especially if they see that as a repeated behavior over and over again. What's that saying about the type of coach or the type of individual that they will become? Because a lot of what we do as coaches is what we learned, what we saw our previous coaches do. So being empathetic is very, very important in regards to not just establishing good communication, but helping your athletes develop into respectable individuals that will, carry on certain behaviors into their lives, into their coaching styles when it's time for them to enter into that profession. Thou shalt not be sarcastic. This is taunting, or trying to embarrass or humiliate or criticize another person. So we kind of just talked about that already. So this is like calling someone lazy who, can't make their sprints. Yes, it might be true that they're not crossing the line after the given time that they're supposed to, but there could be physiological reasons behind that. It may just be because they're not in shape. But being sarcastic can be fatal to open and honest communication because it destroys self-confidence and can eliminate respect between the two individuals of the sarcastic comments. Thou shalt praise and criticize behavior, not personality. So when we talk about praising and criticizing behavior, this is about what actually went wrong, without calling a person name, without saying you're such an idiot, I can't believe that you did that. That's got nothing to do with the mistake or the correction that needs to be made. So we want to avoid two types of praise. So this is the personality-based praise. Oh, you're such a great player. You're such a great person. You're such a great guy. Because what this does is tell the athlete that they're accepted only when they act in accordance with the expectations of others. We also want to avoid something called judgmental praise. Here it is. You are the best. These are superlatives. It kind of creates anxiety and feelings of discomfort because of pressure to perform. And it really gives the athlete very little understanding about what he or she did to be able to deserve such a comment. So praising and criticizing, there's an appropriate way to do that. And your textbook talks about the sandwich approach to praise and criticism. So this is developed in 1977 by Smith and Small, and this is a model that really kind of ignores the past mistake, or at least avoids overemphasizing it, it minimizes it, and instead it focuses on the future performance, what the coach wants to see. So the sandwich approach consists of three elements. There is first the positive statement. I like the way that you tried to do your good throw-in. The next is a future-oriented positive feedback. So this is where the constructive criticism comes into play, where you actually describe what you want to see the athlete do in the future. So it would be, good try in your throw-in. Next time what I want you to do is make sure that you plant both feet and make sure you do that before the white line on the field. And then you follow it up with a compliment. I know you're going to do better next time. I really thought, I really like the way, though, that you had your hands behind your head with the ball and followed all the way forward. So again, it's a positive statement, the constructive or a future-oriented positive feedback, which is specific to what the athlete physically needs to do to correct the mistake or the error, and then again follow it up with a compliment. So if you're a visual person, I like this picture. It basically shows how you start with that compliment, in the middle is the feedback, and then the positive statement is how you end it. This way that the athlete is not focusing on your anger or your frustration, they're not focusing on your behaviors. It allows the athlete to truly listen to what you want them to do to fix the mistake. And ultimately, as coaches, isn't that what we want? We want our athletes to be able to focus on how to correct a behavior so that they don't repeat it, because that causes improved performance. Another commandment, thou shalt respect the integrity of others. Respect entails an awareness of the athlete's feelings, opinions, privacies, and individual differences. Now, that's not to say that anger and frustration aren't present in coaching, but an effective coach will express their feelings without losing respect for the athlete and of the athlete. So let's talk about anger for a second, because anger and frustration are human emotions. They're a fact of life, and it can be a reoccurring state that really doesn't feel very good for the athlete and for the coach. So we need to talk about how to appropriately address this, because to say that we need to eliminate all anger from coaching is just absolutely not realistic. there are times where it is appropriate to show anger in competition. It could be for motivational purposes. If you guys think back to the movie The Blind Side, and there's a scene in the movie where Michael Orr is not performing up to par, and there's a scene where they're playing at a game, and the coach, there's a call from the referee on the coach, and the coach kind of realizes that Michael is very, very high in protective instincts, and he understands that Michael will stand up for and get really fired up and motivated if he sees somebody else stand up to try and protect the team. So when this call was called against Michael Orr, the coach came right up to the referee and kind of said, I will protect him like he is my own, and was very angry with the referee. And that was a way to motivate Michael to improve his performance. So there isn't an appropriate time and place for anger in coaching. And the fact that failure to express anger at certain times, maybe during a practice or a game, would convey to the athlete indifference. And you don't want your athletes to think that you don't have certain emotions about their performance. So there's some ways that we can utilize anger and ways we can handle it appropriately with our athletes. The first two-step process for handling anger is to really be able to identify your feelings verbally by name. So saying, I am annoyed with you, I am frustrated with you, I am upset with you, because sometimes just the mere statement of feelings can change the entire behavior of the athlete. And a lot of times athletes are very aware of the rationale behind the coach's angry emotions. A second step is to actually give the reason for your anger by stating kind of your inner thoughts and wishful actions. I'm really upset because this is not what we practiced. And then follow it up by saying we practice to do it this way, and then be very specific. This is not easy to do. It sounds like, oh, 2 steps, no problem, but think about the last time that you got angry. How did you control it? How did you bring yourself down a notch? How long did it take you to really get yourself kind of off that angry ledge? So it is something that requires practice. It is something that requires control, because a lot of times when people are angry, they are just going. They're not thinking, they're just going, and they're saying whatever comes to their mind because they're being very emotional about it. It's very hard to work on controlling our emotions, and it can take a long time to master that. So as coaches, we have to understand that there's an appropriate time and place for anger, but we also have to understand how to handle it so that we don't hinder our athletes' performance. Thou shalt use positive nonverbal cues. This is about body language, physical characteristics, maybe touching behavior, your voice characteristics. So these are all things that the athletes interpret based on how you move, or you look at them, or the way that the tone that you use in your language. So think about how you're gesturing on the sideline. Think about your physical characteristics. Are you standing over slouched and hunched over, or are you standing very upright with your head up and your chin up? Different types of the way that you stand, maybe the way that you walk. All of a sudden, maybe you're pacing very quickly back and forth. That can send certain cues to your athletes. Touching behavior, whether or not you decide to pat somebody on the back or to give them a high five, or if you completely ignore them when they walk off the field. Your athletes understand, especially after the entire course of a season, they're going to be able to read you pretty well. Voice characteristics. When you get angry, do you get very loud? Does your voice get very high-pitched? Or sometimes, I don't know if anybody else's mama out there did this, but when my mom got really, really angry with me, it got very quiet. And it got all of our attention right away. So is the coach, normally a very boisterous, loud person on the sideline, and then when something makes them upset or something really catches their attention, do they all of a sudden stop and get very quiet with their athletes? Body position, again, using positive nonverbal cues. Don't invade someone's personal space. Give them that space to breathe and to think. Eye contact. Be very careful with the way that you're looking at someone. A glance, a glare, or a gaze could be denoting a different message. So this is something that we kind of need to be aware of. Again, if we identify areas that we need to improve upon, again, it can take a very long time, because a lot of the this stuff, again, is based off of emotion, and that can be very hard to control at times. Now, this one kind of sounds like, well, yeah, duh, of course we should teach skills, but thou shalt teach skills. So, this is when we're talking about sports pedagogy. That's how you say that funny word. It's taken me years to figure out how to say that word, but it's pedagogy. So, this is the science of teaching sports skills and strategies. It is not easy to step up and to lead a team of athletes. It takes a lot of preparation. It takes a lot of practice. It takes a lot of research to lead practices and also to plan them and then also to implement them. So it's not just something where you can throw a whistle at someone and say, all right, go lead practice. So we have guidelines of effective instructional techniques, like establishing a goal. What do you want your players to get out of practice? What do you want them to get out of the entire season? 2, learn by imitation. If you aren't quite sure what you're doing as a coach initially, research what other successful coaches have done in the past and try and implement certain strategies or practices or skills into your practices. Also, eliminate information overload. Good gracious, we know that with social media today, there's tons of clips out there. Gosh, if you go to YouTube, type in coaching skills, football, and you have just an entire list of videos that have been posted by honestly anybody out there that thinks that they know what they're talking about in regards to coaching. So be very, very careful to implement research-based practices, or again, by number 2, really figuring out who the experts in the field are and imitating what they have done, if that's possible, or be able to try and tailor it towards your age level of athletes. Another very effective instructional technique for coaches is to simulate game conditions in practice. This is key in the performance of your athletes, because if you have never put them in any sort of pressure situation or game-like situation in practice, it might very well be difficult for your players to respond, because it is a completely different feeling when you're sitting in front of a crowd and asked to perform. Some athletes thrive on that, and then others need to experience that feeling over and over again to be very comfortable in order to be able to perform. So simulate game conditions. Make sure that your athletes are wearing the same shoes that they would wear for their competition. Make sure that they're practicing on the same surface that they will be eventually competing on. If it's going to be a timed event, put time constraints on them so they feel that pressure of that time constraint. And then also another strategy is to give learners feedback on their performance. This is where you need to let them know and can use the sandwich effect. I really like what you did here, but here's how I want you to change it. I know that you'll do a good job. And maybe you don't have to give them constructive criticism. Maybe some athletes pick up your skills right away and maybe others don't. And that, again, would be a great opportunity for you to practice using the sandwich approach. But it's constructive criticism in that you're pointing out the correct behaviors that you seek from your athlete. You can spend all day telling them what not to do, and at the end of the practice, all they will get out of that practice is what you don't want them to do, and that's not going to help their performance. It's actually going to hinder it. So as coaches, we need to continuously bombard our athletes with, I want you to do this, and I like when you did this, can you repeat that for me? There's also smaller commandments of teaching skills. So one, you want to have your athletes practice. Practice. Also, be patient as the coach, because you know that improvement takes time. It doesn't happen overnight. And then number 3 is learn the right mixture of emotions. Learn your team. Learn when it's appropriate to be, very hard on them, and then learn when it's time to give your athletes a break. The final commandment is talking about interacting consistently with all team members. So this is being fair. This is being repeatedly consistent with your athletes, because players will put forth maximal effort, concentration, and commitment if they really believe that the coach is interested in them, not just as athletes, but also as people. So this requires consistent interaction. So treat Sally the same way that you treat Joe. If you have an ongoing, predictable pattern of communication with others, that's going to provide a level of trust with your athletes. So this is also called constant communication style. Interact with others almost in a non-stop basis. Keep tabs on your individuals' athletes. Talk to them. Pull them aside in practice. If you're a high school coach and you also happen to be a teacher at the high school, say hi to them in the hallways. Pull them aside and say, great job last night. What did you think the team did right? What did you think the team did wrong? Don't just make it about communicating with your team leaders or your team captains and certain individuals. You need to involve everyone in the process, because everyone on the team is responsible for the either success or failure. So treat everyone consistently and fairly. So speaking of treating all players fairly and consistently, we need to talk about the importance of the non-starter, because especially in elite level sports, we won't have fair and equitable playing time for all athletes. We can't do that. It's just not at the core of elite level sports. But we do have to understand that sometimes coaches neglect the non-starter, and it is really wrong to ignore or dismiss the importance of non-starters in sports teams for several reasons. First being, everyone's one injury away from sitting on the bench. And likewise, the non-starter is only one injury away from becoming a starter. So how many athletes enter a game and play as effectively as the starters? Not many. Yet the skill differences between starters and non-starters are often relatively minimal, especially among elite performers. So one reason non-starters do not perform at levels similar to the starters can be partially due to differences in the time and effort coaches offer starting players relative to the players who are not scheduled or to play to start. There's a high relationship between the coach's expectations of player performance and actual performance outcomes in a game. And this is also known as the self-fulfilling prophecy. So this has to do with the fact that coaches that tell athletes that they will be successful and believe that those athletes will be successful, that's related to the athletes in your attitudes, behaviors, expectations, what you say to the athlete. And if someone is typically, given that encouragement that they're going to do fine, they're going to do great, they'll live up to that expectation. Similarly, athletes that are not given a focus, that are ignored, or that are told, you're not as good as this person, or your skill development is very low, athletes will also live up to that expectation that is placed on them. So it's partly dependent on the lack of attention and practice that is given to the non-starters, for whom the coach expects and also gets low execution from the starting players. And ultimately, what we need to understand is that the coach must treat the team as a unit of individuals who jointly serve a common purpose of performing all necessary tasks to win. So an effective coach will make sure to pay very close attention, sometimes even a little bit more, to their non-starters than maybe necessarily their starters, because good coaches understand that it could take a small matter of seconds for one of the elite players to have to come off and a bench warmer have to go in, with keeping the level of play consistent without letting it drop. So we need to pay attention to all of our athletes in order to recognize common feelings of athletes and to give them a fulfilled sense of purpose when it is time for them to step onto the field. We're going to switch gears now, and we're going to talk about when the athlete takes an opportunity to approach their coach to establish effective communication. So we're kind of approaching this from the athlete's point of view. And it's very common for players to feel intimidated or unsure of themselves when it comes to approaching the coach about how can I improve, what can I do better. Maybe they're seeking information, maybe they just need to express a concern, or wanting some advice or feedback. So it's important to understand that both the player and the coach need to make sure that they have those good communication skills. They encourage trust, they reduce worry, and they remove intimidation in regards to that communication. So this is for the athlete. If an athlete wants to establish a meeting with a coach, these are some guidelines that they can follow to make sure that it's an effective and successful meeting with the right outcomes for the athlete. So number one, Athletes are encouraged to make an appointment to see the coach. I know that when I was coaching in high school, I always encouraged my athletes to come see me in my office hours or during my planning period if they had an issue, mostly because during practice I really didn't have time to address individual issues. It was about the team. Um, so I always encouraged athletes, if they wanted to speak to me, to do it in my classroom. Also, plan a meeting agenda and write it down for the athletes, or the athletes should be planning an agenda and writing it down. If an athlete's calling the meeting, the athlete needs to know exactly what they want to get out of that meeting, and having it written down can help the meeting flow quickly and effectively. Also, be on time for your appointment. Show your coach that it's important by dressing neatly or just at least appropriately. It's encouraged that the athlete would take notes, especially if you're dealing with youth athletes. This will kind of deter information from getting relayed back home mistakenly or incorrectly. The athlete can also plan warm-up strategies. So this is ideas of what you will do immediately to start the meeting, whether it's shake the coach's hand, whether it's to give him a high five, something to kind of establish a greeting in order to, number 7, make the opening statement very, very positive. So shaking the coach's hand and then starting off with maybe I statements. I'm really happy about being on this team, but my concern is for this. And then give specific behavioral examples when you're making your point. So again, this can be very difficult for an athlete, a youth athlete, to do because they're children. They're adolescents, and they might not always understand how to appropriately start a meeting, especially if they've been told time in and time out at home what a horrible coach they have, or the coach just isn't making sense. So as a coach, I would definitely give this list to your athletes, maybe in your team meeting prior to the season starting, and say, if you have a concern, if you would like to speak to me about something that's happening, I expect you as the athlete to do all these things on this list in order for us to have a productive meeting and for me to be able to address the issues that you need to be addressed. I'm thinking back now to my coaching, and I don't think I had many athletes that were able to follow a list like this during a team meeting. And a lot of times it was because they were very emotional. It was also with non-starters. I had meetings with players that didn't make the cut, that didn't make the team, and they wanted to talk about things right away when they were emotional upset, and I encouraged them, come back tomorrow, come visit me in my office, and I encouraged them to do some of the things on this list in order for us to have a productive meeting. That's not always to say that they were happy when they left my office, especially if it was a decision in regards to not making the team or making the team. But this can lead to more positive experiences in meetings with your athletes. Again, we want athletes to be agreeable and non-confrontative. That can really impede the process. Go over the agreements or plans that you've established with the athlete, and remember the recency effect. End your meeting kind of the same way that you started it, with a handshake, a smile, the high five, and a positive statement about your future as an athlete. And then keep it to yourself. This is hard for adolescent athletes to do. They want to tweet it, they want to post it, they want to Instagram it, screenshot it, whatever. But encourage your athletes to keep it confidential in order to maintain that level of trust between player and coach. The next section in your book talks about the mentoring coach. Mentoring really talks about sharing values and really truly modeling appropriate behaviors for your athletes. According to Bolton, the essence of mentoring is sharing power, sharing competence, and sharing self. And it truly entails the joy of teaching and assisting others to reach new and higher levels of thinking, decision making, and ultimately performing. Your book talks about different strategies that can assist a coach in mentoring specific athletes. And it involves many different things, from making personal contact with every athlete on the team. If the coach is unable to be the official mentor, have an assistant coach or maybe someone on staff that can be kind of a guide for an athlete. Talk regularly with support staff about the needs of each athlete and make sure that if there is a need identified, that need can be fulfilled. Be genuine, respond honestly, be supportive, and strive to build the player's self-esteem and self-confidence. Encourage an athlete's outside interests as a way to kind of balance their life between sports and real life. Don't treat athletes all alike since they have different psychological need, different backgrounds, different past experiences, and personal characteristics. Now, this is not to say that you shouldn't treat all athletes fairly, but you're not going to approach each and every athlete with the same motivational strategies since we're all very different. When it comes to team rules, again, we've talked about this before, the athletes need to be treated alike. We set a standard and we follow through in regards to team policies and procedures. Making sure as a mentor that we place the individual's best interests above the team's best interests. So we wouldn't have somebody that was injured and because we needed to win, we would put them in and ignore the injury. Also, be aware of the way in which athletes relate to one another. Try to meet each athlete's parents or family members, and remember that your responsibility as the team leader and as the supervisor. It can be a tough role to balance being a mentor and a coach. There's a fine line to walk because sometimes mentors can also get very involved in an athlete's personal life, and we want to make sure that while we're still being that supportive mentor, sharing competence and sharing self, that when we are with the team and we are working towards a common team goal, that there's a time and place to be the mentor and there's a time and place to be the team coach. Why is it important to be a mentor for athletes, whether it's every single athlete on your team or whether you make sure that each athlete has a certain mentor that's present? A couple different reasons. A lot of times athletes need assistance in the areas of life that will improve the likelihood of success and happiness and higher quality of life. Remember, for many individuals, sports won't always be their future. And that's not always necessarily a bad thing. A lot of athletes have not been trained to manage the time constraints placed on them. Lanning did a study in 1982 that basically reported relatively few athletes have developed proper study skills. And if you think about high school athletes, collegiate athletes, their time is split between their academics and attending practice and competitions and other things required of them as an athlete. So mentors are necessary for a couple of different reasons. We want to be able to provide resources for achieving success in academics, in sports, but also, more importantly, in maintaining a healthy lifestyle. Coaches really need to be empathetic about daily pressures and time constraints where athletes are confronted. Another area of reason for mentoring is to helping athletes set realistic goals in sports. And case in point, the NCAA did a research study that indicated only 4.5% of high school football players will go on to play college football, with an even fewer percentage, only 2% of those, actually going on to play professionally in the NFL. So this means only 1 of 10,000 high school football athletes actually get to realize their dream of going and playing pro. So as coaches, what we want to be able to do is, yes, stress your sport, stress your perfectionism within your sport and becoming the best that you can be, but also instilling these lifelong traits and habits in your athletes that can get them to be successful outside of the sports arena when it comes time for them to enter into, I say this with quotation marks, the real world. Being an athlete is awesome. It is fun. There's an audience, and when you're on a very successful team, man, does it kind of boost your ego. But there's going to be a time and a place where you can no longer physiologically perform the functions required of that sport. And we want our athletes to be able to carry over those skills and those ideas about working hard and being a good teammate and listening to their coaches into their jobs, into being with their families, being a good parent, to take care of themselves, not just to make sure that they're successful individuals, but make sure that they're healthy individuals when it comes time for them to leave their sport behind in terms of playing. I believe one of the last topics we're going to talk about is talking about leading effective team meetings. So this is when it's time to address the group as a whole. A couple different strategies. Gauge the group feelings. Sometimes coaches call meetings because there are known problems, and this can kind of give a coach an opportunity to kind of address the problem and make sure everybody's good before it can develop into something of a bigger problem or kind of undermine morale. So they really can be an effective tool to enhance player loyalty, not just to the team but also to the coach as well. Team meetings can also provide insight and information to the athletes, and coaches can get a kind of pulse on what's happening with the team members. Is there something socially that's causing an issue? Maybe so and so is not eating what they're supposed to, and you're trying to address that. This is an opportunity for coach to really understand what's happening behind the scenes, and may not necessarily be actually happening at practice or on the sports field. Team meetings also give the coach an opportunity to humanize player-coach relationships. So this is an opportunity to interact with the players maybe on an informal and non-threatening basis. Typically, athletes are more loyal to coaches who relate to them in ways beyond the role of just being a player. And this also gives players an opportunity to kind of disclose their insecurities, questions, fears, feelings, in order for them to really let the coach see them as a kind of a whole person and not just as their athlete. So a team meeting wouldn't just have to be, chalk talk. It could be, we're having a team meeting tonight over at Sarah's house. We're going to have a pasta dinner. And the purpose of the meeting is for us to just to gather and be kind of a family eating dinner together. Your last slide for the chapter is talking about the 10 Commandments of effective communication for game officials. So we've had opportunities to address effective communication for coaches, for athletes, and now we're going to end with communication in regards to the officials. What officials can do to ensure that coaches and players are listening. Not necessarily always happy with the calls that are being made, but at least hearing and being responsive in regards to what's happening on the field. So we ask that officials are calm. They treat all participants with respect, whether it's the players, the coaches, sideline officials, using positive nonverbal cues, so being very careful of our body language, listening actively, sometimes letting coaches get in the last word, and that's all the way down there at number 10. Actually explaining decisions about infractions. With the younger youth sports, I love it when referees take the opportunity to pull the athletes over and say, this is the call that I made, this is why I called it. Some good referees will even explain how athletes need to correct it. That's kind of a fine line because maybe coaches, don't appreciate, the coaching part of it, because that's the coach's job. But really good officials, especially with younger developing players, take opportunities to explain the infractions in order to help the players learn from the mistake or the rule breaking that occurred. Also, officials, we would expect that they wouldn't embarrass others. They would, just like the coaches, criticize the behavior that's seen, not necessarily the character of the coach or of the athlete. Being able to ignore comments, oh my goodness, I can't tell you how important it is for an official to be able to let things truly bounce off them. There's a time and a place to react to comments, and there's a time and a place just to let them roll off your back. And that can be very, very difficult. Avoid sarcasm when they're making a call. If they're explaining decisions to a coach or to an athlete, we want to be upfront and honest. We don't want to have sarcasm. And again, sometimes knowing when it's appropriate just to let the athlete or the coach have the last word, or when you need to step in and you need to have the last word. So lots of important strategies for coaches, athletes, and officials in regards to effective communication. Great lecture today, guys.